New Brunswick in the fall is an explosion of colors. As you drive, the deep ruby reds and burnt orange burst with color. It's a magical place to be. Your destination is a quiet and quaint seaside community near the U.S. border in Maine. It's a small town that looks like something out of a Stephen King novel. Walking along the historic streets, you see one building that looks odd and out of place. At the top of a small hill is a 2-story granite building with bars on the window. You get closer to investigate. Looking at the cold and lifeless building, you feel like there's a rock in the pit of your stomach and feel a little sick. Then you get the sense that someone is watching you. You get a little closer. That's when you look at the dark window, and through it, behind the metal bars, you see what looks like to be the black shadow of a face. Hi everyone, I'm Nadine Bailey. Join me as we venture to St. Andrews by the Sea, to a place where all the executions in New Brunswick were carried out. This is the Charlotte County Gallows. The town of St. Andrews, known as St. Andrews by the Sea, is a treasure trove of history and heritage. And if this sounds familiar, we stopped by this little village when I shared the story of the Algonquin Resort in episode 19. Take a listen after we're done to hear another spooky story from this small community, which is on the traditional territory, Pescatamookitee First Nation. Located on the watershed of St. Croix River and Passamaquoddy Bay. For generations, the Pescatamookitee lived seasonally. They lived upstream in mid-December when cod were spawning, and then they moved inland to hunt the caribou and tap maple trees. Then headed back down to the bay in the springtime to dig for clams and fish, and spent the summer upstream salmon fishing and gathering. The area now known as St. Andrews was called Conascamga, the fireplace, because it's where the Council of Nations was held and continued to be into the 20th century. That is until, legend has it, a priest from a passing French ship erected a cross of St. Andre on the shores. Then, United Empire Loyalists, fleeing the American Revolution in 1783, established a town, which is now one of New Brunswick's oldest and most distinctive settlements in the province. Eventually, St. Andrews became the shire town of Charlotte County, which means it was a center of justice, local government, and professional services for the region, including the Fundy Isles. The small town is laid out in a rectangle with straight streets forming a grid, with open spaces for public buildings, squares, and a marketplace. As a British town, most of the streets have a connection to the royal or colonial associations. Except for Water Street, which runs along the shoreline, 13 of the streets are named after the children of George III and his wife, Charlotte, while 2 of the streets are named after faithful servants of the Crown. In 1998, St. Andrews was designated a National Historic Site. It is the first and oldest seaside resort town and is home to an extensive collection of authentic heritage buildings dating back to the 18th century, including saltbox and Cape Cod homes. A saltbox house gets its name from its resemblance to a wooden lidded box in which salt was once kept. It is characterized by a steep, pitched asymmetrical roof that is short and high at the front and sloping down in the back, creating 2 stories in the front and 1 in the rear. It is a traditional New England style of home and was originally timber framed. Cape Cod houses, on the other hand, had pitched gable roofs, central chimneys, windows on the door, and porches. As the town grew to be a summer destination, houses were built in the American shingle style with verandas, towers, and balconies designed by Edward Maxwell, a well-known Boston and Montreal architect. Among these picturesque homes is a small, grassy hill. That is where you'll find the Charlotte County Gaol Provincial Historic Site. Adjacent to the white Charlotte County Courthouse, which is a well-preserved mid-19th century maritime courthouse. It is a hard granite building with dark exterior and metal bar windows. The jail is a cold and ominous-looking structure meant to keep people in while terrifying all who gaze upon it. It is a stark contrast to what was once a center of community activities, such as elections, fairs, parades, and official visits. The 2.5-story building was built in 1832 and is one of New Brunswick's oldest surviving gallows. The Georgian-style building is an imposing structure constructed from massive granite blocks shipped by scow boat from the quarry of Deer Isle, Maine, and has remained unchanged over time. The exterior and interior walls are 2 feet thick, which make escaping impossible. Once you make it inside, you walk down a small hallway where you'll see photos and memorabilia on the walls. On your left, there's a large metal red door, which opens to reveal the jail cells. This is where you're most likely to feel the temperature drop, and it's not on account of the perpetual damp which makes bones ache. That sense of dread that washes over you comes from knowing that between 1867 and 1957, 26 men were executed there. Prisoners awaiting their death were kept in one of 10 cells measuring 6 feet by 8 feet. The jails had 5 cells on either side. As you look inside the tiny cells, you feel hopeless and claustrophobic. These cells offered little in the way of any accommodations. The doors are narrow to ensure the prisoners turn sideways to enter or exit. At the bottom of the entranceway, there's a significant 2.5-foot step known as a stumble step. Both design features were meant to prevent prisoners from being able to charge a guard or overtake them. Inside the damp and dark cells, prisoners only had one small, long rectangular window for ventilation and as a light source. In the corner, prisoners had a metal frame bed with no mattress covering the stone floor. On the second floor, there were 4 larger cells meant to house women, children, and debtors. The prisoners of Charlotte County Gallows were often there on charges for stealing, public drunkenness, owing money, adultery, and murder. I mentioned earlier that when you enter the jail, there's memorabilia and other documents on the wall. Some of those are historical documents called session sheets. Written in beautiful cursive writing, you'll find the names of people charged with a variety of offenses. Some of them include James Carter, who was imprisoned on October 6, 1866, for being in debt. He owed Sarah Bradford $11.20. Hugh Brown was imprisoned for assault, and James McCarmus for drunkenness. And then there's Tom Roland Hutchins. He was the last man hanged in New Brunswick, and he's the reason we're visiting the prison today. So let's travel back through time to Friday, June 5th, 1942. Tom Roland Hutchins was 21 years old and originally from Peterborough, England. He was married and had 1 daughter, and he was a sergeant in the RAF, or the Royal Air Force. Canada was at war at the time, and he was stationed nearby in Penfield, about 30 kilometers from St. Andrews, awaiting to see action in the Second World War. On a warm summer evening, Hutchins was planning to attend a dance with some of his RAF buddies. Hosted every Friday night by the Women's Institute at the Community Hall in nearby Blacks Harbor. The dance was in honor of the airmen stationed at the air training base in Penfield. That night, 19-year-old Bernice Connors would also be in attendance. She was an attractive young woman with beautiful dark eyes who was very popular, vivacious, and well-liked by everyone in the small community. Bernice was one of 12 children and still lived at home with her parents, but had the freedom of an adult. She was working full-time at the local fish canning plant founded by her grandfather, Lewis Connors. The plant was a life source for the town's economy. Excited to be going to the dance, Bernice spent the evening getting ready. She did her hair, put on a beautiful skirt and blouse, and headed to the local community hall. The dance was a highlight of the town's social calendar and is where Bernice would cross paths with Sergeant Tom Hutchins. The airman for the RAF had been drinking excessively by the time he was seen dancing with a beautiful 19-year-old. At around 11:10 p.m., Tom and Bernice left the dance. It could have caused a scandal, as the 21-year-old Tom was married, but about 40 minutes later, only Tom was seen again at the dance. But something was wrong, because, quote, he appeared back at the dance hall with blood on his face and clothing, end quote. Regardless of his appearance, he reconnected with his fellow RAF members and they all returned to the base. Bernice's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Edwin Connors, became worried that Bernice had not returned home 2 days later on Sunday afternoon. They assumed she had slept over at one of her friends or relatives after the dance, but after phoning around, they realized that she was nowhere to be found. Meanwhile, that same Sunday, Thomas Guptill and Oscar Craig were out for an afternoon walk at around 4 p.m. The neighbors were walking along a dirt road on the outskirts of town when Thomas Guptill noticed a woman's shoe lying in some grass. It stood out to him as strange. He noticed that it was an expensive shoe, the kind that most women in Black Harbor couldn't afford. By now he had heard that one of the Connors girls was missing, so he took the shoe home with him. When he arrived home, one of his daughters recognized it, and she said that she was certain that that shoe belonged to Bernice Connors. Mr. Guptill phoned the Connors to let them know of his discovery, and that's when Bernice's parents called the police. Investigators arrived shortly after and met with Mr. Guptill. He took them to the spot where he had found the shoe, and within minutes, they found a second shoe. What happened next is disturbing and graphic in nature, so please take care. Police and volunteers began to fan out to search the grassy field near Deadman's Harbor Road, which was only a short distance from the dance hall. As the group combed the area, a young woman, one of Bernice's friends, joined the search. Suddenly, she let out a horrifying scream. Lying in the field, covered in moss, was Bernice's blood-stained and battered body. She was naked. She had been beaten to death with a rock, and her throat had been cut. According to the RCMP, Bernice had also been sexually assaulted. The police officer who found the body told the St. Croix Courier newspaper on June 11, 1942, that, quote, she was naked except for a light garment thrown across her hips and lying on her back with her eyes staring straight upward. Her hands were folded across her chest. End quote. Who could be responsible for this senseless killing? The community was in shock at the loss of the beautiful young woman. The police went to the army base to interview Sergeant Tom Hutchins because he was the last person to be seen with Bernice. It was quickly discovered that his uniform was stained with blood. Sergeant Hutchins was arrested on the spot and charged with the rape and murder of Bernice Connors. On September 29, 1942, Sergeant Hutchins was led into the Charlotte Circuit Court. As the trial began, witnesses say he showed no emotion and simply said, "Not guilty," when called upon. The Crown prosecutor called 35 witnesses, many of whom had attended the dance and had seen Tom Hutchins and Bernice Connors walking outside on the gravel road. Through it all, Sergeant Hutchins sat in the prisoner's dock at the rear of the crowded courtroom, calm and rarely moving. Witnesses say he gave the impression of a man absorbed in the mystery of his own thoughts. He only showed interest in the proceedings when his counsel, B.R. Gus, a young St. John attorney, made a spirited attack at the time element of the case. But the evidence against Sergeant Hutchins was overwhelming, especially after Dr. John M. Rousel, medico-legal expert from Quebec's Medical Legal Laboratory, testified that he had discovered a number of human bloodstains on Hutchinson's RAF uniform. Court then heard testimony from Detective Sergeant Davis, who said that he had located a rock stained in blood on the highway near the spot where the body of Ms. Connors was discovered. After final arguments, the 12-man jury retired to deliberate for 3.5 hours. When they returned with the verdict, mood in the St. Andrew's courtroom was described as, quote, "The accused, one arm resting on the prisoner's dock, eyes intent on the jury foreman, Hutchins heard the fatal word, guilty, pronounced without a trace of emotion," end quote. Then the jury recommended, quote, "mercy to be shown on the accused," end quote. The judge then asked Sergeant Thomas Hutchins if he had anything to say, to which he snapped to attention and replied, quote, "My lord, I have been asked by my counsel not to make any remark at all," end quote. Sentencing would be next. In a tense, packed courtroom a few minutes before midnight on October 6, Justice C.D. Richards, the presiding judge, ordered Sergeant Hutchins to stand. He ignored the jury's recommendation, and Tom Roland Hutchins was sentenced to death by hanging. After the sentence was passed, a low gasp came from the crowd, followed by the judge's final words, quote, "And may God have mercy on your soul," end quote. With his head hung low, Hutchins was led out of the courthouse and walked the short distance to the Charlotte County Gallows next door. He was placed in one of the small cells at the end of the hallway to await his execution, which was scheduled for December 16, 1942. A few days before the scheduled execution, Camille Blanchard, the official hangman for Quebec, arrived in St. Andrews. He arrived with 2 large duffel bags with him, and when he dropped one of them to the floor, it let out a large thud. Inside the bag was the noose that would be used for the hanging. As per the executioner's handbook, the hangman's noose had the recommended 13 coils around the knot. The number 13 is widely associated with bad luck and death, making the noose a symbol of execution itself. Each additional coil adds friction to the knot, which makes the noose harder to pull closed or open. Upon the executioner's arrival, a 2-story gallows was constructed entirely from local wood. The staircase had precisely 18 steps leading to a small yet sturdy platform. In the center of the wooden structure was the trap door, ready to swing open with a simple pull of a lever. Directly overhead, wooden beams stretched across the top where the noose would be tied to. The gallows was covered and surrounded by a fence, which would be patrolled by the RCMP to ensure that no one would witness the execution. As the gallows were constructed, Hutchins sat in his tiny, cold, and dark cell. He listened as each nail hammered into the wood signaled a step closer to his death. He remained calm and waited for his final fate. The night before his execution, Hutchins could be heard whistling a popular song from his cell. His last visitors were the RAF chaplain, a doctor, and his friend, squadron leader Stewart. At 1:46 a.m. on Friday, December 16, 1942, 2 guards arrived to escort him on his final walk. Hutchins was dressed in his Royal Air Force uniform. He took a few steps out of his cell when suddenly he stopped abruptly, turned and walked back into the cell and switched off the light. He then rejoined the group and headed towards the gallows. He did not have any final words and, quote, looked straight ahead to the scaffold and never hesitated, walking steadily up the 18 steps and onto the trap. He stood very still, tilted his chin high as the black hood was placed over him, end quote. The lever was pulled at 1:50 a.m. and he dropped to his death. While many may believe a prisoner dies instantly by hanging, it is not often the case. Sadly, Hutchins hung from the rope for 12 to 18 minutes before he was cut down and pronounced dead at 2:02 a.m. In the dark morning hours, a simple funeral procession traveled from the Charlotte County Gallows to the nearby St. Andrew's Rural Cemetery, where the coffin of Tom Hutchins was buried. The sheriff ordered the jailer to burn the noose and tear down the gallows. Instead, the jailer, George Goodles, disassembled the wooden structure and placed it under the courthouse beneath the judge's chamber. Tom Hutchins was the last person executed in New Brunswick. Ever since Tom Hutchins' execution, staff and visitors to the courthouse museum have reported strange things happening. Many believe his spirit is trapped in the jail cell, the place where he spent his final days. The TV show Ghost Cases investigated the gallows in 2010 and spoke with Janet Fairney, the archives manager, whose office was directly above the jail cells. Janet is a believer in all things spooky and recounted her own encounters inside the prison. She was working in her office one winter when she heard voices coming from the prison cells. She went to investigate and heard a man's voice in Hutchins' former cell. Janet quickly walked to the cell, only to find it empty. She checked the rest of the prison to find that she was the only person in the building. Other staff also reported that when tourists and visitors step inside the jail, they often feel a presence all around them. They claim to have such an overwhelming dread that they must leave the building immediately. Janet and the staff believe that is Tom Hutchins' spirit. In the TV show Cold Cases, hosts Paul and Holly sat inside Hutchins' cold, damp, and dark cell and felt a dark presence in front of them. Paul said that he felt a coldness around his throat and felt as if he was being strangled. Other visitors have felt like they were being watched and claim to have walked in unexplained cold spots inside the building. Yet the most terrifying experiences come from people who have reported seeing a man walking around the prison holding a noose. Many locals and visitors believe that the figure is Tom Hutchins. A review on TripAdvisor explains one strange experience. The visitor wrote, quote, "I went on the ghost walk, and the weirdest things happened. Someone, no one was around, grabbed my waist. Something in the corner laughed at us. My camera wouldn't work, and one of my friend's phone screens kept flipping. All of this was at the jail in 10 minutes. There were other creepy things too." End quote. If you have spent time at the Charlotte County Gallows and have your own strange encounters, please share them with me, because the St. Andrew's Jail is a site where many men met their fate. While Tom Hutchins may be the last person hanged at the Charlotte County Gallows, there could be other spirits wandering through the cold and dreary prison to this day. And maybe they're waiting for you to greet them. Thank you for joining me as we explored the historic and haunted Charlotte County Gallows. Haunted Canada is sponsored by the Ebony Ghost Tours. I will link it in the show notes. Haunted Canada is written and produced by me, Nadine Bailey, with senior producer Dila Velasquez. Production and sound design is by Rob Johnston, with help from Rosin Kufer. If you would like to support this podcast, please follow and share, and if you can give us a like and a 5-star written review, that is always appreciated. Also, you can follow me on our different social media platforms, or if you have a ghost story, haunting, or true crime that you would like for us to cover on this podcast, please email me through the website hauntedcanada.com. Thank you from all of us at Haunted Canada and Curious Cast. Have a good night, everyone, and stay haunted.